A very good morning, students. Today we'll be learning in climatology about air masses of Asia and the North America. In the module of the air masses and fronts, we have discussed about the characteristics and types of air masses and fronts. In today's lesson, it is a continuation to that lesson, so kindly refer to the previous module. The understanding of the distribution of the air masses is also equally important, for it makes us understand the significance of study of such a feature. After going through this module, you will learn about the winter time and summertime air masses of Asia and North America. Air masses of Asia. Wintertime air masses. Continental polar air masses. These air masses originate over extensive areas comprising Siberia and Outer Mongolia, having very cold ground surface. Initially, the air masses are very cold and dry in their source regions. The lower portion up to the height of 1 kilometer is characterized by inversion of temperature. The air masses move eastward and after covering long distances are mechanically modified as mechanical turbulence is produced when these air masses cross over the mountain barriers. This process leads to the disappearance of the inversion layer, resulting into increase of temperature and humidity in the lower layer. These air masses enter China through two routes, through land surface and through water surface. When high pressure lies over Mongolia and North China, then these air masses enter China by land route. They are much warmer in China than in the source areas. These air masses are associated with clear sky and dry weather and cold air. When these air masses come with high velocity, they bring with them immense quantity of dust and sands and deposit them as loess. The continental polar air masses in their modified forms affect the weather conditions of most parts of Asia during the winter season. These air masses do not enter the Indian subcontinent because of effective barrier of the Himalayas. When high pressure lies over Manchuria and the Japan Sea, the continental polar air masses enter China by sea route after moving over Japan Sea and Yellow Sea and thus pick up abundant moisture. These air masses are relatively warmer and more humid than the continental polar air masses coming by the land route. Until they are associated with the fronts, they are characterized by clear sky and pleasant weather. The lower portion is unstable and thus they give precipitation when they ascend along the mountain barriers. The continental air masses coming through sea and land routes converge along the eastern coast of Asia and form cyclones through frontogenesis and cause precipitation. Maritime polar air masses. These air masses, after originating over the Sea of Okhotsk, influence only the coastal margins of Siberia, Manchuria and South Korea, while the eastern coast of Asia or south of Korea are deprived of their influences because the winter air circulation is offshore, that is from west to east, due to which the westward advance of maritime polar air masses is blocked, and continental polar air mass, while entering China through sea route, attains the characteristics of the maritime polar mass. These air masses also invade Japan in early summer and form fronts when they converge with overlying maritime tropical air masses and bring moist weather with overcast sky and light precipitation. Maritime tropical air masses. Maritime tropical air masses do not effectively influence the weather conditions of the Eastern Asia during the winters because of the dominance of continental polar air masses. These air masses are experienced only up to southern China. They are warmer and more humid than all of the maritime air masses. Unstable maritime tropical air masses are more effective in the southwest Pacific Ocean and in eastern Indonesia. Summertime air masses. Continental polar air masses. The source areas of the polar air masses extend further northward in the Central Asia because of high temperature during the summer season due to northward migration of the sun. The air becomes relatively warm, but the continental polar air masses do not effectively influence the weather conditions of eastern and southern Asia because maritime tropical air masses become more dominant during the summer season. The continental polar air masses enter China only through sea route from Japan Sea and the Yellow Sea. These air masses are colder than the maritime tropical air masses. They are associated with clear weather, scant precipitation and negligible thunderstorms. They produce cyclonic conditions whenever they converge with the maritime tropical air masses. Maritime tropical air masses. The weather of the South and the Southeast Asia is controlled by maritime tropical air masses which are known as summer monsoons. They are warm, more humid and unstable. They yield torrential rainfall when they are forced to ascend by mountain barriers largely. After being originated in the southern oceans, they move north and northeastward, and after entering the mainland they are heated from below because of the warm ground surface, and hence they become unstable and conventional currents are produced. The southwest summer monsoons are the Indian subcontinent and typical representatives of the maritime tropical summer air masses. These air masses produce cyclonic conditions when they converge with continental polar air masses during the springs in the central China and during middle summer in Manchuria. Maritime polar air masses. These air masses originate over the Okhotsk Sea, from where they move westward and influence the weather conditions of the Eastern Asia north of 40° north latitude. These air masses are more active during summers than during the winters. They are more effective in Manchuria and East Siberia. Though these air masses extend up to southern Japan in early summer, but they later are pushed northward by the maritime tropical air masses. Air masses of North America. In this article, we will discuss about the maritime winter and summertime air masses of North America. Wintertime air masses. Continental polar air mass. Continental polar air mass is cold, dry and stable, and Alaska, while continental Arctic air masses originate over Arctic Basin and the Greenland ice cap. These air masses move out of their source regions and enter the United States of America between the Rocky Mountains and the Great Lakes. Extensive land surface with topographic homogeneity and slow anticyclonic circulation provide most ideal conditions for the origin and development of the continental polar air mass. The air mass moves in southerly and southeasterly directions and brings extreme cold conditions. In fact, the arrival of the cold polar air mass produces intense cold waves in the vast area of the United States of America. With the result, most of the places record temperatures below the freezing point. After reaching the southern and the southeastern shores of the Great Lakes, the continental polar cold air mass is modified and thus becomes moist and unstable and yields heavy precipitation in the form of snowfall, locally known as the lake effect snow. The modified air mass, when moves eastward, is forced to move upward along the Appalachians, becomes unstable. Colds are formed and the western slopes of Appalachian Mountain receive heavy snowfall. It may be pointed out that so long as the cold continental polar air mass moves over the snow-covered surface, it is least modified, but as it crosses middle Illinois and enters the snow-free surface, it is warmed from below, and thus the cold air mass is modified to warm continental polar air mass and the stability of the air mass decreases. The continental polar warm air mass, while moving through east central United States, meets maritime tropical air mass and polar front is formed, which induces cyclonic conditions and winter precipitation occurs to the east of Rocky Mountains. The cold polar warm air masses modified in the southeastern United States due to the mechanical turbulence produced by corrugated terrains of the southern Appalachians, subsidence of the air from above and resultant stability, and instability in the lower layer of the air masses caused due to the addition of heat and moisture. Maritime polar Pacific air masses. These air masses are called the maritime polar Pacific air masses because these originate in the northern parts of North Pacific, mainly near the Aleutian Islands where winter low pressure is formed. This region is surrounded by continental polar air mass from all sides except in the south. The water surface is warmer than the air lying over it. Consequently, when the cold maritime polar air mass comes over this area and it is warmed from below and thus becomes unstable. This maritime polar cold unstable air mass picks up moisture throughout its journey southeastward to the west coast of North America. This moist air mass gives sufficient precipitation while rising along the western slopes of coast ranges. During summer season, polar Pacific air mass becomes stable. When polar Pacific air mass reaches the Great Plains of United States after crossing over the coastal ranges and the Rocky Mountains, it undergoes the process of thermodynamic modifications and thus is transformed into cold, stable and dry continental polar air mass, which induces anticyclonic conditions in the central states of United States. With the result, sky becomes clear and air circulation becomes slow and temperature returns to normal. Maritime polar North Atlantic air mass. This air mass originates over the North Atlantic Ocean, mainly in the region between Greenland, Newfoundland and Labrador, where winter temperature ranges between 5°F and 40°F, while during summer season it becomes 50 to 60°F. Since the general air circulation in this region is from west to east and hence the air mass has little influence on North America. Sometimes cyclonic winds draw maritime polar North Atlantic air mass in the northeastern parts of the United States, mainly to the east of Appalachians and to the north of Cape Hatteras. This air mass is dry and stable in its upper layers while it is moist and unstable in the lower parts. This air mass brings in bad weather, which is locally known as northeastern, characterized by strong northeast cold winds, exceedingly low temperature well below the freezing point, high moisture content in the air and possible precipitation mainly in solid forms such as snowfall, sleet and hailstorms. Tropical maritime Atlantic air masses. These air masses originate over Gulf of Mexico, Caribbean Sea and the subtropical western portion of the North Atlantic Ocean. They are hot, moist and unstable and are capable of unleashing heavy showers. These air masses affect most parts of the United States east of the Rocky Mountains. Temperature ranges between 21°C and 26°C and remains almost uniform in the source regions. With the result, tropical maritime Atlantic air mass becomes warm and moist air mass. It may be pointed out that it becomes very difficult to this air mass to enter the southern and the central United States in winters because there is complete dominance of the continental polar air mass over these areas. Whenever tropical maritime Atlantic air mass enters the United States, it is cooled from below because it is much warmer than the ground surface and thus becomes dry and stable. This modified air mass is known as the maritime tropical stable warm air mass. This stable air mass is incapable for precipitation, but whenever it comes in contact with continental polar air mass, the upper air instability increases and the air mass is modified to maritime tropical warm unstable air mass. As the air mass rises along the mountain barriers, it yields heavy showers. In summer, the maritime tropical warm air mass coming from over Mexican Gulf brings hot and sultry weather in the southern and southeastern states of the United States of America. The air mass also produces several thunderstorms. Tropical maritime Pacific air masses. Pacific air mass originates over the subtropical portions of the East Pacific west of United States and Mexico, mainly over the high pressure area located to the southwest of California. The air mass becomes stable because of the subsidence of air from above due to anticyclonic condition. This maritime tropical stable air mass is dry, cold and stable near the Pacific coast of United States. Whenever this air mass is associated with cyclonic circulation, it becomes unstable and brings rains. This air mass seldom crosses the Rockies. Summertime air masses of North America. Polar continental air mass. This air mass originates over the snow-covered central Canada and Alaska. The temperature becomes relatively higher in summers than in the winters, but adjoining oceanic areas have relatively low temperature. This air mass is cold, dry and unstable in the source region, but the air mass originating in the cold Arctic Ocean during summer season is initially cold and stable. The stability of the cold and the stable Arctic air mass disappears when this air mass moves southward over relatively warm ground surface and hence is heated from below. The continental cold air mass becomes warm due to thermodynamic modification when it moves over the ocean. When this air mass moves southward from its source areas, it does not cover long distances, but it extends for long distances in the east. The southward movement of the continental polar air masses brings chilly weather in the eastern and central United States, due to which the effects of summer heat waves are eliminated and fine weather sets in. Whenever the continental polar air mass is associated with cyclonic circulation, it produces sporadic rainfall in the north, central and eastern parts of the United States. Maritime polar Atlantic air masses. These air masses originate over the area located between the Cape Cod and Newfoundland. Initially, these are cold and stable. These reach as far south as northern Florida, where temperature is reduced by 15 degrees to 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Low temperature, clear sky and full visibility are the weather characteristics associated with these air masses. Thus, these air masses produce fine and pleasant weather in the region extending from Newfoundland to Cape Hatteras. There is no ground fog due to dry condition. Maritime tropical Atlantic air masses. These air masses originate near Bermuda, where high pressure is formed. They move northwestward and control the weather conditions of vast areas of the United States east of the Rocky Mountains during summer months. Thermally induced low pressure over the southern and central United States draws maritime tropical air masses far inland, but the existence of the polar front in the vicinity of the Great Lakes restricts their entry to Canada. Since temperature and the moisture content in the air increases considerably due to the arrival of these air masses in central and the eastern United States, the weather becomes oppressive and unpleasant. As these air masses move out of their source areas and enter the United States after crossing over the Gulf of Mexico, the surface temperature increases and they are modified into maritime tropical unstable air masses because the heating of the overlying relatively cold air mass causes atmospheric instability. Thus, thunderstorms and cyclones are produced which yield heavy showers. As the air mass moves northward, it loses its moisture content and becomes dry in the upper Mississippi Valley. When these air masses move westward and rise along the Rocky Mountains, they yield heavy downpour with cloudburst. Similarly, when they cross over the Appalachians, they give heavy showers through thunderstorms. Maritime polar Pacific air masses. Maritime polar Pacific air masses originate in the area near the Aleutian Islands in the North Pacific Ocean. The air mass becomes stable because of the subsidence of air from above during the summer season. Thus, the air mass becomes cold and stable. It may be pointed out that the continental surfaces are warmer than the water surfaces of the Pacific Ocean. Thus, the maritime air masses are warmed from below when they reach the continental areas. This causes greater turbulence in the lower layer, marked decrease in relative humidity, disappearance of clouds and dry weather. No doubt, the temperature of the west coastal areas of the United States of America, mainly the Californian coast, is reduced during the summer season with the arrival of these air masses. After crossing over the Rocky Mountains, maritime polar Pacific air masses are modified and resemble continental polar air masses in physical characteristics. Maritime tropical Pacific air masses. These air masses originate in the tropical North Pacific Ocean off the west coast of the Central America. These air masses are marginalized because of the prevalence of maritime polar Pacific air masses along the west coast of North America in summers. Continental tropical air mass. This air mass originates in the source region comprising Mexico, western Texas and eastern New Mexico of the United States. The daytime characteristics are high temperature, significantly low humidity and scanty rainfall. The air mass moves to the Great Plains and causes extreme arid conditions. It produces drought conditions if it stays for a long period over an area. Summary. Most of the migratory atmospheric disturbances of the storms, which generate a larger part of the precipitation all over the world, originate at the fronts or the zones of contact between the air masses having different physical properties. Weather conditions associated with these storms are largely governed by the characteristics of the air masses associated with them. Air mass analysis technique enabled meteorologists to understand various weather phenomena more clearly. Thus, the study of the air masses is crucial. Thank you and have a nice day.